Okay, Mark chapter 1. We're going to begin to read at verse 21. It says, Then they went into Capernaum, or Capernaum. And immediately on the Shabbat, he entered the synagogue and taught. And I'm sure Gideon will have something to say later, but of course this is remains of a synagogue here. And it is my understanding that the dark stones that are underneath, and I don't want to steal his thunder, may have been from the first century. But he'll tell us more about that later. But anyway, that was perhaps the area of this synagogue. But he went into the synagogue and he taught, and they were astonished at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority and not as the scribes. And there was a man in their synagogue with an unclean spirit, and he cried out. It's always, never mind, I better not say that. A man, he was in the synagogue, and he had an unclean spirit. You don't know any of those kind of people that come into the houses of worship, right? That they need to cast something out of them. Anyway, but he cast out this unclean spirit, and it was right here in the midst of this synagogue. In verse 26, it says, But when the unclean spirit had convulsed him, and he cried out with a loud voice, he came out of him. And they were all amazed, so that they questioned among themselves, saying, What is this? What new doctrine is this? For with authority he commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him. And so, as Gideon was sharing with us, he came from Nazareth, but really his ministry was based in this area. And it tells us that from this place and from the events that took place here, the fame, if we can use that word, of him began to spread out from this particular point. If that was where Peter's mother-in-law lived, it was somewhere over in that area that he healed her. Somewhere around here is where they let the man who was crippled down through the roof. It was in this village, and all those things occurred. So many miracles took place here. But the one thing I wanted to share with you, well, two things actually, is somewhere in this region, perhaps not in the village itself, but somewhere in this area, in Mark chapter 1, in verse 40, it says this, Now a leper came to him, imploring him, kneeling down to him and saying to him, If you are willing, you can make me clean. And the Yeshua, moved with compassion, stretched out his hand and touched him, and he said to him, I'm willing, be cleansed. And of course, he healed him of his leprosy. But then in verse 44, it says this, See that you say nothing to anyone, but go your way, show yourself to the priests, and offer for your cleansing those things which Moses commanded as a testimony to them. And of course, what did he do? He went out and started telling everybody, right? But here's the point. Yeshua told him, now that you're cleansed, you're to go and offer the gift that Moses prescribed for the cleansing of a leper. So where does he have to go? He's got to go to the temple. Where's the temple? It's in Jerusalem. And he's to offer the gifts. And you can read about what the Metzorah, the leper, the one who was cleansed, the gifts that he had to bring and the ritual that he had to go through, etc., before the priest could pronounce him to be clean of the Metzorah. So he says, I want you to do this as a testimony to them. And who would the them be? The priests. Because there is some literature that suggests that in the whole history of Israel, there had never been an Israeli male who had been cleansed of leprosy. There's Miriam, and then there's Naaman the Syrian. But there was not a record of an Israeli male being cleansed. And so some rabbinical literature suggested that one of the signs of the Messiah would be that a leper cleansed of the Metzorah would give the offerings and the gifts that Moses had prescribed. And so Yeshua basically does this. He has sent word through this man who's been cleansed of leprosy that the Messiah is here. And the next thing you see in Mark chapter 2 is the healing of the paralyzed man. But look who's there in the crowd. It says in verse 6 that and this is Mark chapter 2, that some of the scribes were sitting there and reasoning in their hearts. Of course, he's just told that man, your sons are forgiven you. And they're reasoning in their hearts, and they're saying, why does this man speak blasphemies like this? Who can forgive sins but God alone? But immediately when Yeshua perceived in his spirit that they reasoned this within themselves, he said to them, Why do you reason about these things in your hearts? What is it easier to do? To say to the paralyzed person, your sins are forgiven you, or to say, arise, take up your bed and walk? Which, by the way, what is the answer to that question? What's easier to say? Your sins are forgiven you, right. But if you're going to say somebody, take up your bed and walk, they better get up and walk, right? But what does he tell them? He says, so to prove to you that the Son of Man has the power to forgive sins, I'm going to do what's harder. I'm going to say to the paralyzed man, take up your bed and walk, which is exactly what happened. And so he does this in the presence of all of these scribes and all these people who are sitting there in the crowd. Well, very good chance that those scribes came from Jerusalem. Why? Because for the first time in history, they have seen a man who was a leper, cleansed of leprosy, and comes and offers the gift. And according to their own literature, that is an indication that the Messiah is here. You see, Yeshua didn't go around saying, I'm the Messiah, I'm the Messiah. You know, a lot of people, and especially in the States, they go around saying, I'm a prophet, I'm a prophetess, I'm a this, and I'm a that. And Bill's opinion is, if they have to put it on their business card, they're not one. Okay? Yeshua didn't do it that way. He just did what the Messiah was supposed to do. And he let his deeds speak for themselves. And so those actions, that ministry, there was a purpose to those things that he did. And there's other miracles that he did in different places that, yeah, they were a miracle and an individual or a group of individuals benefited from that. But there was also a reason behind it too. He was very subtly, but very Hebraically saying to those who had an ear to hear, the Messiah is in your presence. In fact, you remember there was a man who was deaf and dumb. Remember? And he healed this man who was deaf and dumb. Well, the significance of that is because rabbinical literature teaches that if you come in contact with someone who is possessed with an unclean spirit, if you obtain their name, then you get authority over them and you can cast that unclean spirit out. For instance, when he said to the man, or to the unclean spirits in the man, what is your name? He says, we are legion, for we are many. And he cast them out. But what happens when they can't speak? So again, another one of those things that only the Messiah would be able to do. And so when he encounters this person who is deaf and dumb, can't tell him, can't speak, and yet he heals him. You remember what the people said? Is this not the Son of David? Is this not the Messiah? Is this not the one that you've told us to be looking for? And you remember what the religious people said? He does these things by Beelzebub. What I'm trying to say is that the Messiah didn't just go randomly around necessarily doing things. When he did things, there was purpose to it. And many of those events, many of those miracles, many of those very significant announcements to those who had ears to hear that the Messiah is among you, many of those things happened right here or in this region. So this is how many times have you heard this already? A very important place. There's a big spiritual imprint here. And so it's good that we can be here.